I'd first like to thank the AMOS conference for hosting this dialogue, and congratulate really the organizers for a job well done on this conference. It has continued to grow. There has continued to be more emphasis on the space situational part of it, which as we continue to go, as Jordy said, it may not be a problem today, but it could be a problem in the future, and we want to make sure that we prepare ourselves as best we can for what's coming in the future, and just so we're all on the same page. Paul, Sandy, Leilani, excellent job. Brian Whedon, thank you so much for putting together all the SSA stuff. Just some very fruitful discussions, which I think really help the momentum going forward. There will obviously be a lot of follow-on discussions, and we've already sort of set up a path forward to have discussions at some more major conferences in the future, including this one, which I think will help get us from here to there. But just kudos to all of you for a job very well done. And with that, I'd like to now introduce our other panelists who will be joining us today. Don't forget, though, by the way, we've got the text number, I think will be coming up here. And I've got an iPad here, and I'll try and see if I can figure that out. Leilani, you may have to come up and help me. But we'll see if we can't get those wrapped into the discussion. So again, I will introduce our keynote speakers, give them a few minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll start really in with the Q&A session, okay? So first, I'd like to start with Dr. Tim Flohr. Tim Flohr is from the European Space Agency, ESA. Tim is a space debris analyst and co-lead for the Space Surveillance and Tracking segment in ESA's Space Situational Awareness Program. He's been working in space debris and space surveillance topics for more than 15 years, and today his main tasks include supporting operational collision avoidance activities both for ESA and third-party missions. He works on re-entry predictions, risk assessments, and again, collision avoidance. Tim, would you like to give us a few remarks?
Okay, thanks, Pat. Yeah, good morning, and it's really a pleasure being here and introducing my view on SSA and small satellites. And as Pat said, I work for ESA and in the Space Debris Office, and there we are the focal point for all space debris-related activities in the agency. And as said in SST, which is a part of the SSA program of ESA, we are supporting the further development of European SST capabilities, primarily through research and development and demonstration activities. But I'm also a delegate to the IADC, the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, where I currently chair the working group that looks into the modeling and evolution of the space debris environment. So I may say that I'm quite interested in the topic of small satellites from various aspects, and I'm curious what or how small satellites affect SSA and what SSA can do for small satellites. I may also add that I like very much the great opportunities that come with small satellites. So they, as was said by Jordi, they bring new approaches to spaceflight and related technology developments. And the small satellites make the access to space for many easier. And the recent trends in miniaturization of space hardware, combined with the provision of affordable and standardized components of spacecraft and structures, is opening up space to new players, as it was said in the keynote before. And this may rapidly increase the traffic into orbit. And this comes then with various issues on sharing the resource space. And in essence, one may say that small satellites set a step change to how we use space. I think it's still a bit somewhat ambiguous what is a small satellite and how it is defined. Is it defined by its size, by its mass, by the operations concept? Is it defined by the mission complexity? And how do you approach then these tiny sats that are below the tracking threshold of an SSA system? As it was also said before, there are different and new actors coming and into the game and planning to place into orbit smaller and smaller satellites, and often in massive releases. Just to add some more examples, there was 2 consecutive days in November 2013 where Minotaur launched 28 mini satellites, and at Dnepr the day after released 30 mini satellites. And just 1 month later, an Atlas launch released 13 mini satellites, so quite some traffic. So small satellites no longer only provide access to space for education and for testing of new components. Commercial entities are becoming increasingly active too, and some have announced to start building up large constellations, sometimes dubbed mega constellations. Not necessarily these have to be small satellites, but of course it's more likely that these large constellations are made of small satellites. And these constellations become a source of severe concern for other, the established operators by potentially increasing the spatial object density above a critical threshold. And this is true especially for certain very distinct regions where they want to operate. Recent studies, such as published by a European ad hoc study group, assessed now the possible long-term effect of these large-scale constellation deployments. Okay. As it was said before, small satellites follow non-classical approaches, both for the design and for the operations. They also bring with them new type of operators, and some of them may have very limited resources for the development and the operation of their mission. Often, new technologies and components are still tested on small satellites, which is great, and it is a cost-saving and fast approach to in-orbit demonstration. And in general, the range of objectives, use cases, and design approaches of small satellites is huge, and I would say much larger than compared with classical satellites. The same considerations as for the design of the space segment also apply for the ground segment, and there we come again closer to SSA. The operations concepts, and in consequence then also for the effective satellite's operational and orbital lifetime. So for me, the major issue for SSA today is the quick identification of release and also of dysfunctional objects which may happen. The assignment of an identification to massive releases can sometimes be still debated, and only sometimes the atmospheric decay tells who is who in a launch. And beyond that, and irrespective of the design approach and the maturity of the components, it's rather common for small satellites to follow cheap flight dynamics and operations scenarios. And this is sometimes purely relying on publicly available two-line elements. So also there's a link to SSA. And this approach has some major implications because it means SSA information has to be available, and SSA systems have to rapidly track, discriminate, and identify the satellites. And then we come to the point of augmentation, the observability of small satellites, when we, as we heard, can use passive components and proposals like small laser retroflectors or dipoles to increase the cross-section to radar. There's even the potential to add unique patterns that would allow to discriminate several similar satellites in these Mars launches or constellations. It's a good idea because that would also support the operations of the satellite again. If we use laser ranging, for instance, still after the end of life, because then your satellite still can be tracked better, which is for the benefit for other operators in the domain, possibly involved in a closer approach to this no longer functional small satellite. Also, many of the small satellites have no own attitude control system, and then such a ground-based technology could also help them assessing contingency situations. Okay. Coming closer to the end of my introduction, I would really ask whether we sufficiently distinguish between small missions and large deployments. I agree, both are trending subjects, both follow non-classical approaches in the design and operation, or have to, and both open access to space for a new and very heterogeneous class of operator communities. The resulting challenges for SSA may be similar, but they have different reasons. So SSA, in essence, not only helps operating small satellites, but is also a key aspect of space debris mitigation, understanding the effect that small satellites have on the long-term environment, long-term evolution of the environment. And the final point on SSA is to remind that for the process of registering satellites, you have to have an identification. You have to be seen with your small satellite. And that, I think, is the major point. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. Also joining our panel today is Dr. Bhavya Lal, just to the left of Tim. She is a very important player in our domain. She is a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis, or IDA, Science and Technology Policy Institute, which is a federally funded research and development center, where she leads the strategy, technology assessment, and policy studies and analysis in areas related to commercial space, space property rights, space and nuclear power, space situational awareness, planetary defense, and global trends. Bhavya?
Thanks, Pat. So I wanted to make 3 quick points. The first one is reiterating something Jordi said earlier. The sky is not falling. And just to give a little bit of the data that Jordi gave also, with the caveat that the past does not, you do not use the past to predict the future. Of the 425 or so CubeSats that have been launched since 2000, 155 remain. About 126 have deorbited. That's a very small fraction of the total number of resident space objects in space. Obviously, this is going to change, but just get the ground facts straight. So it's really important. The second point is all of the CubeSats, except for one picosat that was released from a Peruvian 1U CubeSat, all CubeSats are tracked by JSPOC. Important point. Third point, not only have there been so far no collisions related to CubeSats, there have been, again, it's hard to know the numbers for sure, but there have been very small number of maneuvers that have been caused by CubeSats. So about 3 in 2016 so far, 2 in 2015, and 3 in 2014. And the ISS, one of the biggest, most important assets that we worry about in light of conjunctions and collisions, they have not had to maneuver because of a CubeSat-related challenge. It's really important to keep all this in mind. And the reason for that is, we don't make hasty decisions. I mean, there's a lot to be done and a lot to be thought through, but the sky isn't falling yet. The first point. The second point is, as a member of the CubeSat National Academies Committee, it behooves me to tell you that we need to change the narrative around CubeSat. And again, I'm repeating a little bit of what Jordi said. CubeSats aren't a nuisance to just to be dealt with. CubeSats have already performed high-quality science, and they have a lot of potential to perform future high-quality science in solar and heliophysics, planetary sciences, astrophysics, earth science, biological sciences. So it's a very important part of our satellite ecosystem. The third and the final point is the US is only one of 36 players in the CubeSat world. 36 countries have launched CubeSats. So it is truly an international problem. I grant you that. However, the United States has launched more than 75% of all CubeSats. So we are the big gorilla in the room, and it behooves us to be addressing a lot of the challenges that we will be talking about today and in the coming years.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Diana, or Bhavya, sorry. Our next speaker, certainly not least, is Diana McKissick. Diana works for the 18th Space Control Squadron, 21st Space Wing at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California, as the lead for the Space Situational Awareness Sharing Program. In her current position as the SSA Sharing Lead for 18th Space Control Squadron, she focuses on executing U.S. STRATCOM's SSA Sharing Program by facilitating data and information exchange, directly engaging with current and emerging satellite operators, and educating the space community on the benefits of working closely with JSPOC to ensure mutual success. Diana?
Thank you. So I think actually quite a few of you in the room have probably crossed my path before as the lead for the SSA sharing cell. Generally, when anybody needs SSA data from the JSPOC to support research or operations, it comes through my team. So what's fairly exciting is that when I started this job in 2010, we had a very, I think, defined customer base. But over the last few years, I've seen so many new entrants come to us looking for information, trying to figure out the best way to do operations. So really the core of the SSA sharing program is spaceflight safety. So I think we have a bit of a different perspective than some of the other folks on this panel. Colonel Putnam talked the other day about the fact that we support satellites through the full scope of their lifetime. So that includes pre-launch coordination all the way through to reentry, deorbit, or disposal. We do most of this through the website spacetrack.org, and I hope everybody here is very familiar with that website. If not, please get familiar. And this is the way that we really share all of the data that we generate with the entire world. So over this conference, I feel like there's been two words that have kind of dominated conversation, and that's complexity and collaboration. So I was thinking about that in terms of how we do operations now, and I thought that the things we're seeing in the small-sat and CubeSat community could actually be demonstrated very well through one recent launch. So in June, we had the PS LVC-34, 20 payloads on the launch out of India, and I'll just go ahead and read who was on this launch. So we had the Cartosat 2 Charlie from Israel. We had 2 CubeSats from Indian universities. We had the Lapan A3 from the Indonesian Space Agency, Biros and BSAT, both from Germany. The fun part about that one is that BSAT came out of Biros about a month after launch. M3MSat from Canada, SkySat C1, commercial operator in the US, GHGSat, another Canadian university asset, and then, of course, our flocks. So you can see that, several years ago, we would have 1 or 2 payloads, and now we're dealing with 20 from every sector of the space community. So we've really changed our approach to providing spaceflight safety support and have started engaging with folks as early as absolutely possible. So we took a look at this list, and luckily we had existing relationships with quite a few of them, which is great because we rely on their partnerships to get us information to do operations better. The fun part is the folks that have probably never heard of the JSPOC. So these Indian universities, we send them emails and we basically say, we're this military entity and we want to give you information for free. How about you give us your information in return? And so sometimes it's fairly interesting. Some people are very receptive and some aren't. So what we've actually done is tried to put as much information on spacetrack.org as possible. So for every new entrant, we send them our spaceflight safety guide for operators, and it basically details all of the spaceflight safety services we provide, as well as the information that we need from operators to do our job better. And Colonel Putnam made this point the other day, is that spaceflight safety is a two-way exchange. And then we also send them a paper we wrote in 2014 with CubeSat recommendations. And very basic guidelines. We're hoping to make them a little bit more sophisticated. But it basically comes down to the fact that we need to talk to you as operators or launch providers so that we can optimize our mission support. So just to go back to the Indian launch, unfortunately, we don't get launch plans from every agency. We have fantastic relationships with many, and I cannot express how instrumental that is to our mission planning. In this case, however, we were lucky because many of the operators were very forthcoming with information. So we were able to process the launch. And during our launch process, there's basically 3 phases. So it's tracking, cataloging, and identification. And the tracking happens fairly quickly if we have the launch plan and parameters. Cataloging can be difficult, but I think the CubeSat community is getting much more aware of what you can do to help us facilitate that, and that's all in that recommendations paper. Identification is really the challenge. And what we've seen, and we saw it in this launch, was the more communicative an operator is with the JSPOC, the faster you're going to get that identified. And the faster we can get it identified, the sooner it's into our conjunction assessment screenings, and we can start screening it against not only other objects, but the ISS especially. And that's, of course, our top priority. So overall, the launch was successful. It did take us a few days to get some of the flocks sorted out. But Planet is always a very supportive operator and helped us with that. But throughout the whole thing, it definitely demonstrated that we have this balance of complexity and collaboration. And the more collaboration we have, it tends to reduce the complexity. So I would encourage all of you to go to spacetrack.org and take a look at the paper we've written. If you have any suggestions, we definitely welcome them. And I'd also ask you to kind of spread the word through the community that you can come talk to the JSPOC and the 18th now, both apply, and that we're here to help. For spaceflight safety, we are absolutely here to support optimal operations.
Very good. Thank you, Diana. Y'all know Jordy, and you've got his comments, so we're going to have you chime in a bit here. One of the things that I heard twice here in our little pass-through is that the number of small satellites today, when you compare them to the greater whole, is small. And the sky is not falling. And there were two caveats that I heard, and the caveats were yet. Okay? So, Tim, I'm going to start with you and have you maybe touch on that a little bit, because I know that you have done a ton of work and been very involved in this, the future space debris environment. But what is the, not the onesie twosies, but sort of these mega constellations that are being envisioned? What is the impact to the space environment based on these mega constellations? Because they're not just scattered randomly throughout the space environment. They're typically put into some sort of an orbital regime, a certain altitude, certain inclination. Can you talk a little bit about that and the impact that that could have in the future?
Sure. I understand this is a stunning question. I may refer to one first step into looking into this was this study by European colleagues, which involved partners from agencies, ESA, CNES, UK Space Agency, DLR, and academia from Southampton and Braunschweig, Germany. And that was published 5 months ago in Acta Astronautica. It's quite an interesting paper, I think. And if you want, I can briefly go into what was done there as a first step, as said. Because it was said here, today the small satellite situation is rather neutral in front of the fragment-dominated background population. And the question was, when these large constellations come up, how robust are our currently existing guidelines for that? And so they started using the IADC guidelines that go back to 2002 and then revised in 2007. And they are reflecting an assumption, a business as usual scenario from the 90s. And obviously this is no longer valid with these large constellations. So there are different announcements out there of companies wanting to place large constellations into orbit. And in this study, they didn't want to select one of these and analyze it, because as you can understand, these are commercial operators, and only the future will tell which constellation actually will then be there, or many, or which not, or in which form, and they can still change. There's quite some uncertainty going on. So what they did is they built up a hypothetical constellation of 1,000 satellites, 200 kilograms at 1,100 kilometer altitude, 20 orbital planes, 85-degree inclination, which is kind of a blend of all that is what is proposed out there. And for the purpose of testing the robustness of the guidelines, I think this is very much appropriate. So also to test the effect it has, they decided to be rather optimistic, which means they assumed a responsible operator who has 100% success in collision avoidance. So it means in the operational collision, operational constellation, no collision occurs. And all reach end of life, and then start doing active deorbit to a 500-kilometer circular orbit from which they meet the 25-year regulation or guideline that is in place. They also assume nothing explodes. Also, nothing explodes in the other environment, which I understand is not true today. We had quite some explosions already this year. But okay, as said, it was just to test the robustness. And what they found is, I think, rather interesting, because they found that for a post-mission disposal success rate, which means at the end of the life, you go to this 500 kilometer, and that you do with 90% success. The constellation is actually invariant for the population in the long term. So you see a peak over these 50 years in the in-orbit population, but then the trend goes on as it would do without the constellation, more or less. And for 100% post-mission disposal, it's fully neutral. And there we come to the critical point today, and Jordi said that in his introduction, the typical success rates in LEO for standard satellites are, I don't know, 50% or lower. And as was said already, CubeSat, based on their low area, on their low mass and quite high area and their low orbital altitude, comply much better with existing guidelines than others. And but okay, I understand that still 90% is a challenge, and it is not a number that you can reach today with today's design. So also there you have to be innovative, and that's the main message that I took from this study, is that the designers of small satellites and of constellations have to make sure that they understand the need for space debris mitigation, and they understand the consequences for the long-term sustainability of the environment. And that's why they have to find solutions to come to very high post-mission disposal success rates. And then we hope that we can go on. So
I think we've all heard at least a little bit about, this Kessler syndrome. Is there a I guess maybe a location? Doug Lavero said it very well the other day, that everybody wants to be on beachfront property. Are there certain orbital regimes where there are really potential for something like that to occur that would basically take some orbital regime out of commission? And if so, is that a near-term thing? Is that a 10-year thing, 20-year thing, 30-year thing? Could you touch on that just a little bit? Yeah.
Engineering answer, it very much depends. I think this was said before here. It really depends how many objects you deploy in which regime and how responsible you operate it. If you make sure you take out your stuff after you operate it and you operate it responsibly, then there's no such problem. However, even without large constellations, there are studies showing that if we go on with space debris mitigation today as we do in the last years, if we follow a business as usual scenario, then we can and probably will run into a Kessler syndrome in the long run. And that's why the conclusion was that large, massive objects who have the potential to fragment into many smaller objects, and then these smaller objects set in this Kessler syndrome have to be taken out by active debris removal. That was the recommendation that was made some years ago, and also Jordi mentioned that in his talk. It's the massive objects that bring the risk for the Kessler syndrome.
Right. So Diana, a little bit to you. The 2009 Iridium Cosmos collision obviously had a dramatic effect on the way that the 18th Space Control Squadron does business now. Could you talk a little bit about maybe how that has impacted the work you do and how it's going to lead you into the future?
Absolutely. So I like to think that out of every bad situation comes a lot of good, and I think Iridium Cosmos is a perfect example. So it shifted the whole way the DoD looked at spaceflight safety. So prior to that incident, we were only screening our own assets and supporting NASA and doing the same. And after Iridium Cosmos, we realized that the only way to keep our national assets safe was to empower operators to do the same. So that's when the sharing program really started in about 2010, and the JSPOC took it over at the time. And so we started providing conjunction assessment information to every operator of an active spacecraft, regardless of your affiliation, your country, or even the mission your satellite was doing. And we still do that today. So from 2010 to now, the amount of information that I see us share is amazing. And we do this because we think it's in our best interest to empower operators to make good, responsible decisions. And I totally agree with Jordi that when there's guidelines and advice, operators are so willing to cooperate. So that's kind of where we're trying to take the sharing program now as we face some of these new issues. Is how can we continue to empower the community with the best possible, or I should say highest quality data, and then let other entities kind of shape regulations and rules.
Okay, so that leads into another question. I've heard the conversation brought up this week several times about enforcement versus empowerment. Enforcing rules and regulations upon satellite operators, or maybe it's a combination of both, or empowering them, giving them the knowledge and the tools that they need to do things in the right way. Could you talk about a little bit about your thoughts on empowerment versus enforcement?
Absolutely. So going back to the launch I was talking about earlier, the diversity in the space community is huge. And I've been lucky enough to see how different entities take different approaches to spaceflight safety, how they have different thresholds, how they use different data inputs into making decisions. And it's not the DoD's position to regulate or advise on how an operator should make a decision. So that's why we provide data and then look to the community to inform best practices. And I think we've talked a lot about that, is that the best way I think the small sat community can increase its safety and credibility is for operators themselves to kind of formulate these guidelines.
Yeah, please, Bobby.
So what I wanted to add was 60% of CubeSat owners are universities, NSF, NASA, military. These are not necessarily commercial entities. These are folks who would need a lot of education and support. So it's not just a matter of maybe sending them emails or materials. They need a lot more handholding. And just related to that, the other issue is, and Jordi had mentioned that we need to learn, this is a learning lesson period. And I think one thing we should learn from the larger satellite issue is that we shouldn't be solving small sat policy issues in these silos. So orbital debris is obviously one important part. There's also the spectrum issue, the launch at the choke point issue. ITAR was brought up, international norms. All of these things need to be addressed simultaneously, and the spectrum issue is another one where there's huge both education and enforcement components, and there might be ways to bring the two together.
Yeah. So how do you go about, because the community is significantly larger than the number of people in this room. It's significantly global. What are some of the concepts you all, and I guess I'm posing this to all of you, is how do we get the word out? How do we bring the community together in a way that we get significant buy-in so that we can really move forward with this in a global way? I don't know who exactly to address that question to, but Bhavya, maybe you could take a stab at that.
I guess a little bit. I mean, I'll repeat a little bit of what I said. Since such a big fraction of this community is at universities, these are places where they are used to getting educated. So it may not be as difficult to get the word out as one might think. And at least, again, 75% of CubeSats are U.S. Owned. So between NSF, NASA, there are ways to communicate through grants or whichever mechanisms the CubeSat operators are getting their funding to get some of this information.
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I may add from my agency perspective, and working with a lot of countries in Europe, and also means working with a lot of universities. We have made the tools available to them. We have a debris risk assessment software which we give to them. We have training that we provide. I think it's slow. We are maybe too slow, but we are starting. We understand that we have to go to them and get them. And I can just report back that the feedback we get is very, very good. They are very open. I mean, they are students, of course. They want to learn, and but then they really take it into account. And what I think is also beneficial if they then go to the industry. and they have heard about space debris and space debris mitigation, then they act in that respect also in their jobs. So it should be also in the interest of us reaching out to the students.
So again, a question for all of you, but as you have to reach out to this broader community, it seems like to get true global buy-in, there need to be many different organizations, defense organizations, civil organizations, commercial organizations, universities, et cetera. How do you ensure that you get good inputs from each of those organizations? Because they'll all have their stake in this situation. How do you do that in a way that allows us to get from here to there in a timely fashion and not get bogged down in the system of saying, oh yeah, we'll have this handled in 15 years, because that's too long of a time frame, right? Jordy, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to pipe in a little bit. 2 points. One is, if we try to make it an enforceable rule, then I think it's going to take a lot longer. I think if we make it an empowering guideline, it's a lot easier because we don't need as many signatures. That's just because of that. But the other thing is that there is a clear bottleneck between a satellite and space, and that's the launch. And those numbers are growing, but it's still a relatively small group of operators that put rockets and launch things into space. And that may be a good entry point. If those guys have those guidelines and that documentation, and they inform people that are going to fly with them immediately, okay, you got to launch with us, read this, these are some guidelines, it will help us find your spacecraft. That may be the easiest way. I think we would probably want to catch people earlier than that, because a lot of people go look for a launch when they're done with their spacecraft. But that's a point where you're going to hit everybody before they make it to orbit, and the word spreads very quickly from then on.
Right. So, yes, please.
So there's more U.S. CubeSats on foreign launchers than foreign CubeSats on U.S. launchers. So we can have our own, the U.S. rules, good, but there's no CubeSats going on U.S. launchers. So we need to work with launchers outside of the United States. Right.
So sticking to the launcher thing, we've seen at our conferences, Jordy, there are now, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's 30 plus, something like that, launch organizations who are trying to develop small satellite dedicated launch vehicles. Now, not all 30 of those will be successful, right? But a handful will. And each of them have their own way of doing business. They have their own way of doing procurement. Sometimes you can go just online and buy a ride. The launch vehicle is leaving at this time. You pay us $100,000 and you get to space. It seems like that does nothing more than complicate the problem of getting all the launch providers together. Maybe I'm wrong, but
no, I think you're totally correct. But I think we're in this mode where if we do it now,
yeah,
we have an opportunity to influence. If there is a nice document that Rocket Labs and Virgin can use to inform their small sat, cluster launch operators with a bunch of guidelines, I guarantee you they'll use it, because they're really busy getting the rocket to work. So they don't want to spend their time doing that. Right. If there's nothing, then each one will come up with something on their own.
Right.
But I think it's one of those things that we can be preemptive now. Yet there aren't 30 launch providers.
Correct.
Yet.
Right.
So if we can get the 7 or 8 or however many there are now to agree on something and say, yeah, if something like this was available, that would be really easy for us to use, the chances that the new players will implement them are very high.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, in order for this to continue probably in a successful way, on follow-on discussions, we need to involve launch providers, which we don't happen to have today, but that would be a good thing to do, right? Let's see, let me put this on the table just for a random discussion. There's been a lot of talk over the last several years, and I've heard a lot of talk even at this conference about this 5-year deorbit policy, right? And so there we're typically talking about LEO satellites. There are some missions which have 15-year lifetimes that orbit the Earth for 15 years, and they do a great job. But there are also missions, technology demonstrations, low-cost science missions that do their missions in 6 months or a year or 18 months. Should that whole kind of, I guess we call it a policy or a recommendation, for them to deorbit in 25 years, should that be applied evenly across the board? Or, I don't really understand all the driving forces behind there.
That's a good one. And it's actually interesting because it's 25 years after your mission ends.
Yeah.
So if you claim a 10-year mission, then you can be up there for 35 because it's after the end. I don't know if there is a reason for the 25-year number. I've never heard it.
Perhaps it's something we could revisit. Right?
Yeah. But I think there is no reason why you couldn't revisit it. And I think in the U.S., you look at NASA, Ilana, some of the DoD launches, and everybody's targeting much less than 25 years.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's
Yeah.
good. Bhavya? Yeah.
A National Academies Committee talked about having that period instead of 25 years be some, multiple of the life of the CubeSat. The question is, what is that number? And that's the thing to be discussed.
Right.
And I just wanted to throw a number out since I'm the number thrower on this panel. The average lifetime of the 126 CubeSats that have decayed is approximately 290 days. So these things really don't last very long up there,
Right.
at least for the moment.
But that's because of an orbital thing, right? They didn't actively probably maneuver to reduce their time. Most of them just use orbital dynamics and drag to reduce their time frame, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, if I may add here, of course it's strange that if you can't maneuver and you extend your mission time, it's a definition question. But we should not forget that in the international context, there were some technical assessments and they were agreed then by consensus that led into this 25 years for whatever reason. And now they propagated into international standards. And these standards are made applicable to many projects. And one of them is the Space Debris Mitigation Standard. I also understand it needs to be explained better how it can be verified and how can it be applied. So there's more explanation needed. And in ESA, we made an effort to develop a space debris mitigation guideline verification handbook. It's a very complicated title. I think it's not even English. But the purpose of that book then is something you give the designers of a mission at the hand, and then they can check even already at very early project reviews in their space debris mitigation plan whether they follow these standards, which for us is applicable as a kind of internal law. So if you want to touch this 25 years or whatever regulation, it may have a lot of implications. Some countries made it a law. Some didn't do anything. Some, made it applicable. So it's a touchy item. We have to be careful, I would say.
Jordi, we've heard a lot of discussion this week and in the previous several months about making it easier for Diana to do her job to track satellites. Whether it be RFIDs or retroreflectors or something. What are the things that as a small satellite operator that you all are thinking about in terms of simple things that can be done to help the SSA side of the house? And yet at the same time, I guess maybe the follow-on question is how do you get buy-in from the greater community to actually do those things, right?
Let me answer them backwards.
Go ahead.
The first thing is that, and this was not immediate, but I think we finally have gotten to the point where the community understands that the JSPOC and the 18th is where their TLEs come from. And that was not necessarily the case at the beginning. There was this website that, like everything else, you push some numbers in the Google and you get your TLEs. I mean, what else could there be? And now people understand that there is a lot of work behind that, and that those people are in some ways doing you a favor. They're telling you where your spacecraft is. And I think that that's very important. That has really helped us get that community engaged and trying to help. I think the technology is important. We have RFIDs and reflectors and all those things that people are coming up with. The one thing is they need to be made available. I think if we made them available, people would use them. But at this point, we have some challenges on how do we deploy that technology. There's other things people are doing. Beacons were very useful initially, but there are challenges with RF regulation. So now we're having a lot of CubeSats are using GPS, and they'll have localized beacons where they'll transmit over their country, over the US, and send their TLEs directly. Aerospace Corporation pioneered that, where on the first pass we knew where they were, and that took them out of the equation. So we're working little things. I think one of the things that is interesting to me is that the first few weeks are a little bit of a blur, and it's difficult to find the spacecraft. JSPOC has a great system. Once we know who you are and where are you, it's a relatively easy task to just continue to track that spacecraft. When propulsion arrives, that's when we have, I think, our next challenge. When people start doing maneuvers and then you lose them. And I think for that one, it's again a guideline issue. Please let us know. Let us know how certain you are about your delta V. I mean, are you testing a valve that you never fired before and it could get stuck open? If so, how much delta V do you get?
Yeah,
What's
because
your pointing accuracy?
I would think from Diana's perspective, knowing ahead of time that somebody's going to do a propulsive maneuver and at least an estimate in what direction and how many meters per second of delta V would be greatly appreciated by you and your organization, right?
Absolutely. And so what I think is interesting is that as CubeSats evolve, I don't think they're going to be as unique to all spacecraft in general. So we already have guidelines on submitting maneuver notifications, submitting your positional information on a regular basis. What we've seen over the years is that catalog maintenance is a collaborative effort. We have great sensors, we have a comprehensive network, it's getting better, but it really comes down to the operator's involvement in maintaining that data that allows us to have a higher accuracy catalog and improve our spaceflight safety services. So as CubeSats evolve, I really see a lot of these guidelines building synergy to all operators.
Right. So I got to be honest, I forgot if I asked you that question yet or not, but I want to ask you about spacetrack.org. That is something that I've heard dozens of times already this week. Could you give us all a 101 version of spacetrack.org? I'm looking for things like who runs it, why it's important, how it's used, what kind of information needs to be provided by the operators, those sorts of things.
Okay. Yep. So spacetrack.org is run by JFCC Space. So it's a military website in the public domain, which is a huge benefit because it allows us to have a much more effective way to disseminate our data. So within the sharing program and data sharing in general, there's different levels of services. So we have our basic services, and this includes positional information in the form of two-line element sets, reentry and decay predictions, and then the satellite catalog. And all of this is available to anybody who registers for an account. And I think right now we have about 120,000 registered users around the world. In addition to that, we have a dedicated area on the website for satellite operators and spaceflight safety. And this is where, during our early engagement pre-launch, we make sure that the operators have spacetrack.org accounts. We make sure that they're set up to receive the conjunction data messages through the website. And this is also a means, and I think this is one of the most important features, of them sharing their contact information and spacecraft status with the rest of the community. So they have the ability to actually populate their contact information and tell another operator if their satellite's maneuverable or not, to help in active-on-active situations make more timely decisions. And then in addition to that, we also have a permission space file area, which a lot of you actually probably have access to, and this is how we serve a lot of our researchers and US government contractors. So the nice thing about SpaceTrack is actually we work very closely with the development team, and the vast majority of what we have on that website has been informed by operators, telling us what they need to be able to give us information in a more effective way. So Colonel Putnam talked about that the other day, the maneuver notification format. That basically came out of operators, very similar to what you're saying. It's saying, just tell us how to do it, give us a format, and we'll do it. So that's where that came from. And I see the website continuing to evolve to meet a lot of these new needs.
Right, right. Here's a question from the audience. I think most of our discussion so far has been based around people who want to do the right thing. This question comes in, it says, with the expected proliferation of microsats, how do we prevent bad actors and non-compliance with international norms and standards? Who wants to take that one
I think
on?
that, and Diana probably should take this one. But one thing that I see is that right now, everybody's kind of in the same boat. If we get a good set of guidelines and 95% of the people are following the rules, then you spend your time going after the 5%. You kind of know. There is this satellite that's maneuvering and it's not telling me. That's probably somebody that I want to pay more attention to. The problem is when you have to track everybody and everybody's a potential bad actor, then you have a harder time. But I'll let Diana speak to that.
No, that's actually, I think, our philosophy on data sharing in general is as long as you know who you're cooperating with, you can dedicate many more resources to those who aren't. And that's why I think as a community, we need to be sharing information with each other. It doesn't even necessarily just have to be with the JSPOC per se. We need to be more, I think, transparent with each other so that cumulatively or cooperatively we can identify the bad actors.
Yeah. Here's another question from the audience. I'll sort of paraphrase here a little bit, but they talk about launching above like 600 kilometers with no deorbit capability planned for the future. One of the, just a tremendously awful thing that could happen to our business would be for somebody to punch a hole through the International Space Station, right? So what are your thoughts on deploying above the International Space Station altitude as one example?
I think that the issue is the station is very low, and you get into really low lifetimes if you deploy below a space station. I think there are some altitudes that are too high, but that's more from a lifetime perspective. I think there is no avoiding the fact that we will go through the International Space Station altitude. I think we probably should avoid that plane, so we have less time in close proximity.
Stay out of the inclinational plane, right? Yeah.
And then I think it's an issue of tracking. I mean, as we said before, the numbers are not there yet where we're concerned that it's a likely event, but we still want to watch and track and be careful.
Okay. Here's another question from the audience, fairly generic, but I think it raises a good point. What is the view of the panel on who should develop the guidelines for CubeSats? Right, that's a very open-ended question and a very tough one to answer. But how do we go about moving down the process and getting from here to there? I don't have a good answer. Do any of you have any thoughts?
I can speak to history, and this was a completely grassroots organization or standard that emerged from the users and evolved with the help of the, let's call them the professionals. When we showed up at a launch and the launch provider said, well, we're worried about this and this and this and this, we added that to the spec. And I think what we need to do is put something out and then evolve it and as an open source document that it's shared amongst the community. And that has been actually quite effective. And I think it requires collaboration between the two sides. The developers need to engage and look at what's there and raise their concerns and pay attention. And the same thing on the tracking organizations and the launch providers. They need to tell us, hey, yeah, I really like what you're trying to do, but you forgot, X, Y, and Z.
Tim.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I very much like the approach. We should just make sure that we still see a small satellite as a satellite. And at the top level, if you have space debris mitigation guidelines, they should apply for all satellites. Below that, of course, I mean, make your best practices for small satellites and tailor it to your needs. But of course, at the top level, it's a satellite. And I can report that in Europe, when we look into the further evolution of this standard, actually we were approached by people from the CubeSat community. And they said, okay, we would like to participate. And there were really good discussions with them. And they bring a completely new view. And they are not as evil, as you said, as you may think.
Here's one that just touches on, I think most of our focus here has been on LEO. The question here is, the 25-year deorbit standard really doesn't help much when you're talking about HEO, GEOs, or highly elliptical orbits. That's another regime that we're going to have to start thinking about because people are actively building satellites to fly in those areas. Now, there haven't been a lot of them, but at some point in the future, there could be. And there's nothing to say that some scientist with a great idea or a way to measure the Sun-Earth connection and putting them in GEO wouldn't be the most fantastic thing that NASA has ever seen and they would want to fund. How do we deal with those sorts of issues?
I think we start slow, and that's how we've done it in this community for a while, and I don't think anybody's going to go to the GEO ring anytime soon. I think we'll be super GEO or sub GEO, and we'll be around GEO. But I think we need to creep up to that regime because it's very valuable real estate, and we cannot make a mistake in the ring. So we'll have to find ways of playing nice and accomplishing that mission without jeopardizing the real estate.
Right. So, Tim, I mean, this is obviously a global problem. This is not just a U.S. problem. From a European Space Agency perspective, what are some of the things that you guys are thinking about? And I guess part of the question I also wanted to get to is, does the European Space Agency think the same way about space traffic management as the United States does, or other players that you're involved with?
Well, I don't know. Usually the view on terminology is a bit different in Europe and the US, and I think it may be that it is also for space traffic management. What I see in the US is space traffic management is how you operate in your satellites in a space debris environment, and that we do. Yeah. Whether we see other points on that remains to be seen. I mean, it's an ongoing discussion. I'm not ready to comment on that, but I can say that for the point on operating spacecraft in the space debris environment, we do this since 2006. We have an operational process. We hosted workshops together with folks from the US where we brought together the European operator community. I think we were quite instrumental in getting the first version of the conjunction data messages out. So we are approaching this and supporting this very actively. And today I think we have a very well-established process for our own satellites, and I can say that we are relying very much on the data sharing agreement that we have as one of the two intergovernmental organizations with the US, and this is a daily job that we do.
Yeah, Bhavya, this whole global thing that we're up against here is certainly probably just as much political science as it is rocket science. So, can you talk to some of the larger things, or how we really need to go about dealing with the entire getting the global space force on the same page to move forward in a way that's good for all of us? I know that's a disastrously large question, but...
Yeah, I think maybe we need to shift our perspective. I think in the olden days we could do this. Space was a strategic sector, controlled by governments. and there could be top-down directive. Now, as space bifurcates into this, remaining to be a strategic, important sector, but there's this other consumer-driven, more enterprise-driven sector, which is it's hard to control it. I mean, they think differently, they work differently, they have different ways of revenue. So I think this whole concept that there would be something that can just filter out is just from the top is difficult. The new regime needs to be more decentralized, needs to be more bottom-up, and I think Jordi already referenced some of that. So I think we need new thinking on how we would manage, whether it's SSA for small sats or in general the space domain.
Right, right. I want to get this out on the table. We've just got a few minutes left here. I just want to get your comments on this. I read an article last week that was published in Conversation UK by a University of Kent law professor, Govinda Odenton. He says that current space law is inadequate to handle the issues of liability and the responsibility of accidents. And I think what brought that about was the SpaceX explosion on the pad here not too long ago. And that most space law was developed decades ago, before the rise of the commercial space activities. So probably most of the people who put those laws into place and signed off on those and actually did the work on those probably could have, I doubt, foreseen where we're at today. We're at a very different place in space than we are today. But the legal regime, the space law has not been adequately amended for the space privatization exploration. Is it time for an update? And if so, how do we even go about starting the discussion on that and getting that moving forward? I'm staring at Bhavya because but anybody can take that question. I can't.
From an operational perspective, I think we do need to reconsider kind of the spectrum of responsibility. When we process an event, I've definitely seen that it takes information, cooperation, transparency at every step of that execution, from the pre-launch coordination, the launching agency, the operator, the deployer. And so it seems that we should examine a way to hold all of these different steps in the process somewhat accountable for going forward. How that happens, I have no idea. But I think as space traffic management evolves, I hope that these are some of the issues that they'll consider.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
I just wanted to add that, I think we just worry about all these new issues we are discovering. I think it's exciting. We are entering this new era where we are bringing the solar system into our socioeconomic realm, and we'll find new problems. We'll figure out how to solve them.
Yeah. This is a great environment to work in. There's just some we got some growing pains to work through, so that's okay. Last topic.
Let me add
Yeah.
one thing to the liability and
Yeah.
all that stuff. And the UK had a law until recently where the universities had to pay the insurance, premium for their satellites. The UK as a nation was not going to take responsibility, and that put the program behind years and years. They were just not launching. And I think that's one of the issues that we have to be very careful, that if we take such a low-risk approach that we cannot do anything, that may not be the answer either.
Yeah. Last thing here I'll kind of throw out on the table is a lot of the licensing that was put in place. I'm more familiar with the U.S. licensing, but a lot of the licensing that was put in place was put in decades ago. And it was really a time when we were launching, 20, 30, 40 satellites a year. Each of those programs probably were launched at a cost of several $100 million, a few $100 million at a minimum, some upwards of $1 billion. And there was a process put in place to get licensing and regulation. Now people are every day building satellites that cost $1 million. Or $2 million or $5 million. They do not have the staff resources to deal with the licensing and regulation that a $500 million program does. There are also greater numbers, as Jordi showed in his chart of the growth. It is expected, and I think it's going to come pretty close to 500 satellites being launched by the end of the decade. That is a significant advancement in numbers, way over what we have seen in the past. So is there a way or that we can streamline the process so that our licensing people and our regulators don't get bogged down to death in dealing with moving people through the process so that they can do their job without having to hire another workforce of 1,000 people? Anybody want to take that on?
I mean,
It's dangerous because the regulators, you know, I need their help, so I'm not going to say anything bad.
I know, we need their help. We need their help, but it's got to be the right size, right? It's kind of got to be right size for the cost of the program.
I think NOAA was a very good example. When CubeSat started launching and then we started putting cameras on things, nobody knew that there was a NOAA rule that you had to get a license. And that goes to the thing about, you know, openness and the guidelines being out there. This was not a guideline, this was the law, and we had no idea. The students were putting cameras on these things and launching them, and at some point, you know, somebody noticed and said, hey, there is a law that you can do this. And pretty quickly, NOAA realized that they were going to be bombarded with hundreds of applications, and they said, most of them are cell phone cameras, I don't really want to see them. So they developed a one-pager to screen out the 90% that I don't need to worry about. I think things like FCC may not be as simple because you still have to coordinate, but we need to streamline the processes. The processes that work for 2 or 20 do not work for 300. And I think the agencies are aware of this. I don't think we're the ones that need to worry about it. As they have to worry as well. So everybody's working together to try to streamline it, but it's gonna be hard.
Yeah.
I agree with Jordi in that agencies are thinking about it. You know, NOAA for remote sensing, FCC for license spectrum, and FAA for launch reentry, and you know, hopefully on orbit. But I think it needs to be sped up. I mean, I think we just, you know, there are trade-offs with, you know, losing competitiveness and other sorts of issues that we need to think about. So some of these things just need to be done a little bit faster.
Excellent. Diana, any last-minute comments?
No, I'm very happy that the JSPOC and the DoD doesn't have to worry about the licensing process. But what I would like, what I think would be beneficial to the community as a whole would be in the licensing process to have a recommendation or a requirement to register with a data provider of some sort, so that from the very beginning they're aware that they have a responsibility when it comes to spaceflight safety.
Yeah.
So.
Tim?
Well, not directly for licensing. I'm not a licensing guy, but just for the small satellites, just get it seen by SSA systems and make it reliable to meet space debris mitigation guidelines. So that's my message. And then you get a license, hopefully.
Well, very good. It is time for our coffee break. It is 9 o'clock. I believe we could go on for a long time with this discussion. I did want to say one thing again, kudos to the conference organizers. Brian, excellent job. Paul, Sandy, Leilani, and here's the reason why. I believe that there has been a lot of talk in this area over the past year or two, but I think, at least in my mind, this conference and the discussions we've had has really brought to bear the fact that we need to do something. Okay, it's not an emergency. The sky is not falling yet. There is a caveat there. But there have been several conversations between those of us who run some of these conferences and are involved in the Secure World Foundation, the space situational awareness aspects, the small satellite providers, the European Space Agency, and we have decided, we do not know how we're going to move forward with this yet. It is still up in the air. But we are going to form some sort of I don't know, maybe coalition's not the right word, but we are going to start talking more and more about this at some of these upcoming events. I hope we can do this, something like this, Paul, maybe again next year. I'd like to see this happen, Jordi, at your CubeSat workshop. I am committed to doing this or something like this at the Small Satellite Conference next fall. So this will give us more and more opportunities to work on this and maybe bring some more players into the realm that can help us get from here to there. With that, I'd like to thank our conference panel today on SSA for a job very, very well done. Thank you.